Well, I don't want to tell you exactly, but we are certainly looking at land now because we've got the sea very well under control.
At 4:36 in the morning, a Venezuelan patrol squadron silently slipped out of Puerto Cabello, maintaining complete radio silence, speeding across dark water with only heavy machine guns and vintage Soviet launchers visible on deck. The crews operated under the belief they were pursuing a lone American destroyer. A straightforward target labeled Echo 2 inches on a shore-based radar screen. What they failed to realize was that the radar image was flawed. The coordinates were obsolete, and the sea ahead concealed something far greater than any destroyer. A single misinterpreted signal was about to place them on a collision course with one of the most powerful naval formations on Earth. An error that could have ignited a crisis before sunrise. And this was only the first indication that a minor error in the Caribbean could expand into something much more perilous. If you wish to follow every moment when political miscalculations nearly transform into military disasters, don't forget to subscribe to Military Power, because what follows will demonstrate precisely how close this standoff came to open fire. At 5:21 a.m., radar operators aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower detected 4 unidentified surface contacts approaching rapidly from the south. The movement pattern did not align with any known commercial traffic, and the vessels were operating without transponder signals. The carrier's Combat Direction Center swiftly flagged the contacts as potential threats. Their speed, formation, and trajectory immediately raised alarm. Within moments, the entire strike group began adjusting its posture. The USS Gravely and USS Mason, both Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, advanced to forward positions. They altered course to establish a protective wedge in front of the carrier, a standard naval tactic employed to intercept fast-moving threats before they reach the formation's core. This defensive maneuver positioned the 2 destroyers directly in the likely path of the incoming vessels. Each destroyer activated its radar and missile tracking systems, and combat teams shifted to full alert. Readiness was intensified across the task force. Aboard the Eisenhower, the Combat Information Center merged all available data, from radar arrays, sonar input, and satellite feeds, into a unified tactical display. This capability allowed commanders to monitor developments instantaneously and coordinate between ships with precise situational awareness. Every sensor in the strike group began tracking the approaching contacts simultaneously. Above the surface, 2 MHz -60R Seahawk helicopters ascended from the Eisenhower's flight deck. These helicopters are equipped with sophisticated dipping sonar, infrared cameras, and electronic surveillance equipment. The mission was to verify the type of approaching vessels and detect any weaponry or unusual heat signatures. The pilots climbed to operational altitude and began visually scanning the sea. Their systems locked onto the incoming craft and started recording their movements. As the aerial sensors confirmed the vessels were small patrol craft flying Venezuelan flags, the strike group implemented additional precautions. Orders were issued to maintain the current speed and heading but to prepare all weapon systems for defensive action. Sailors manned gun stations, missile launch crews verified target acquisition channels, and fire control radars commenced active scanning. The carrier itself remained at the formation center, shielded on all sides. The decision to not change course or make any aggressive moves adhered to established U.S. Navy rules of engagement. These protocols are structured to avoid unnecessary escalation while maintaining full readiness for self-defense. The priority remained deterrence, not provocation. However, all personnel understood that the situation could change within seconds. From the CIC aboard the Gravely, radar returns indicated that the unidentified vessels were persistently closing the distance without altering their course. Based on their trajectory, they would soon enter visual range. The watch teams aboard the Mason and Gravely increased scanning frequency and checked for any sign of fire control radar from the incoming boats. On the flight deck, aircraft crews prepared a second Seahawk helicopter in case broader coverage was required. At this point, the U.S. fleet still had no direct radio contact from the approaching vessels. The silence compounded the uncertainty, without identification or communication. Naval doctrine required maintaining posture while avoiding engagement unless provoked. The task force now faced a fast-moving formation closing in tightly and low over the water. with unknown intentions and no declaration. While the surface ships maintained their defensive geometry, the helicopter teams provided real-time visuals, confirming that weapons were mounted forward on the Venezuelan craft. Although no hostile action had yet occurred, the presence of visible armament pushed the alert level even higher. Each second that passed without a response only added more pressure. As the incoming boats neared the engagement threshold, commanders aboard the U.S. ships remained focused on preventing miscalculation. The balance between caution and readiness became increasingly difficult to sustain. Yet, despite the growing tension, no shot had been fired. The formation held. The next phase would depend not only on military posture but on how both sides interpreted the same unfolding scenario. The moment of first contact was rapidly approaching. As the Venezuelan patrol group closed in, their formation changed. Two vessels maintained a direct path while the other two shifted to the flanks, creating a pincer shape. This maneuver was not random. It mirrored classic naval tactics used to enclose a target. Although no shots had been fired yet, the pattern suggested the approaching force was not simply passing through. Their intent was to get close. Satellite data and surveillance from the carrier group later confirmed that the Venezuelan boats had followed a preset intercept route. The formation allowed for simultaneous approach from multiple angles, a tactic that increases pressure on a target ship while complicating its defensive calculations. Based on their speed, distance, and alignment, they would reach firing range in just minutes. According to later assessments by military analysts, the Venezuelan plan was not to engage in full combat but rather to perform a calculated show of force. The objective was to approach close enough to fire warning shots, capture footage of a standoff, and use the images for state-run media broadcasts. These types of maritime confrontations are often designed to claim symbolic victory rather than create physical damage. However, the foundation of their plan was flawed. The radar data guiding the patrol was at least 48 hours old. In that time, the Eisenhower strike group had changed position and tightened formation. What was once a lone radar echo had become a fully protected fleet. The Venezuelan command did not realize they were entering a coordinated zone with overlapping radar coverage and layered weapon systems. At sea level, the first warning shots came without radio communication. Small caliber rounds were fired into the water, not directed at any U.S. vessel. The bursts were short and spaced, designed more to be seen than to cause harm. But on board the American ships, those muzzle flashes triggered immediate escalation. Under rules of engagement, any visible weapon discharge near a U.S. warship activates defensive protocols. The radar operator aboard the USS gravely switched to target tracking mode. Simultaneously, fire control systems aboard the USS Mason began to calculate trajectory and distance. Aboard the Eisenhower, commanders elevated the alert status to Condition 1. This is the highest defensive posture, where all weapons crews are in place, systems are powered, and the fleet is ready to respond in seconds if the threat continues. The CIWS, close-in weapon system, and RAM, rolling airframe missile, turrets rotated into position. Missile hatches opened on the forward decks. The 5-inch deck guns were manually checked by gun crews. No commands were given to engage, but the strike group stood at the edge of full response. Visual confirmation of gun barrels on the Venezuelan boats raised tension even further. Each ship in the formation focused sensors on the lead contacts. Electronic warfare teams scanned for radar lock signals. Helicopter crews kept watch from above, transmitting real-time updates. The Venezuelan boats continued to move forward. Now within several nautical miles of the outer ring, there was still no direct radio communication. The Venezuelan captains maintained silence, possibly believing that warning shots alone would deliver the message. But from the perspective of the U.S. fleet, that assumption was dangerous. The absence of dialogue combined with visible weapons placed everyone at risk. As the gap narrowed, timing became critical. A single flare or sudden move could trigger a defensive burst. The seconds stretched long aboard the U.S. ships. Combat teams waited. Trigger discipline became the only thing preventing an exchange of fire. In naval operations, reaction time is measured in seconds, but decisions must account for broader consequences. At this stage, each side was preparing for a different outcome. One expected a symbolic warning, the other was bracing for an attack. The pressure continued to mount, and the next step would determine whether the situation remained a standoff or crossed into open conflict. At 6:07 a.m., the situation shifted from tense to critical. One of the Venezuelan patrol boats, identified by its hull number 23, suddenly broke formation and accelerated toward the USS Mason. Its heading was direct and aggressive, and its speed exceeded 45 knots. Within seconds, the range had dropped below 1.000 yards for a naval encounter involving armed vessels. This was dangerously close. The U.S. Navy responded with an internationally recognized warning signal. 2 flares were launched from the Mason's deck. Clearly visible in the early morning light, these flares are standard indicators used to demand that a vessel change course immediately. However, there was no visible reaction from the approaching boat. The vessel maintained its trajectory and speed. The silence and persistence suggested either miscommunication or a deliberate act of pressure. The alert level across the formation escalated further. The radar systems aboard the Mason detected that the Venezuelan boat had activated its fire control radar. This type of radar is not used for navigation but for targeting. Once it locks onto another ship, it indicates the intent or readiness to use weapons. Under U.S. rules of engagement, this is treated as a final threshold. Defensive action becomes authorized if a threat continues without de-escalation. Fire control teams aboard the Mason and the Eisenhower monitored the radar input closely. The phalanx CIWS turret aboard the destroyer rotated and tracked the target automatically. Its sensors calculated distance and closure rate in real time. The ram launchers confirmed readiness. Sailors at gunnery stations prepared for potential live fire response. A single command would have triggered multiple layers of defense. From above, a U.S. Navy Seahawk helicopter continued its surveillance flight. Its sensor systems picked up the outline of several crew members aboard the Venezuelan boat. One image showed the boat's gunner adjusting position. At that moment, an onboard microphone captured the distinct sound of a charging handle being pulled back. This mechanical noise is produced when a weapon is prepared to fire. While no shot had been fired yet, this action was interpreted as the final step before engagement. The tension aboard the American ships became extreme. Weapons were locked on, radar warnings were active, and the timeline for response had narrowed to seconds. Yet, even in that moment, the order to hold fire remained in place. The decision not to engage was based on strict adherence to policy and the desire to prevent accidental war. Every crew member was aware that a wrong move could trigger irreversible consequences. At the last possible second, the Venezuelan vessel altered its behavior. Just as it closed to within 800 yards of the Mason, the boat sharply veered to port. Its engines roared as it broke off the approach, turning in a wide arc and kicking up a trail of white water. The maneuver appeared sudden and uncoordinated. Within moments, the remaining Venezuelan boats also began to disperse and shift away from the U.S. fleet. No missiles were launched, no shots were fired, but the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was a pause heavy with the awareness that both sides had come within seconds of exchanging real firepower. The U.S. formation remained in full readiness. Sensors continued tracking, and weapons stayed primed until all contacts had moved to a safe distance. This near miss underscored the razor-thin line between deterrence and disaster in a contested zone, where conflicting narratives and political motives shape every move. The difference between a warning and an attack can shrink to a matter of seconds. The patrol boats had turned back, but the danger had not fully passed. The incident was not yet over. What followed would move the conflict from radar screens and sonar blips to news cameras and diplomatic statements. By 6:08 a.m., the most dangerous phase of the encounter had passed. The lead Venezuelan patrol boat had pulled away after reaching within 800 yards of the USS Mason. Its sharp turn signaled the start of a wider retreat. One by one, the other vessels in the formation changed course and began moving south, away from the American strike group. The rapid withdrawal marked the end of the immediate threat but not the end of the alert. The U.S. Navy ships maintained their positions in readiness. Although all sensors confirmed that the patrol boats were retreating, the carrier strike group did not relax its posture. Radar and infrared tracking continued, fire control systems remained active, It was standard practice to observe a threat until it moved entirely beyond engagement range, in this case. That range was measured not only in nautical miles but in behavioral certainty. The Eisenhower formation remained intact. The carrier held its speed at 20 knots and stayed on its original heading to the north. There was no effort to pursue or challenge the retreating vessels. The decision reflected strict adherence to U.S. Navy rules of engagement. Under these guidelines, even after hostile behavior such as warning shots or radar targeting, force is used only when there is no other option. The presence of restraint is considered a strength, not a weakness. Inside the combat information centers of the U.S. ships, officers monitored the final movements of the Venezuelan patrol. Sensors showed that the contacts had spread out, some traveled west. Others returned toward their point of origin. The lack of coordination in their withdrawal suggested a breakdown in command or a shift in decision-making after realizing the true size and readiness of the American force. Despite having legal and tactical justification to engage, the U.S. fleet did not fire. This action was guided by broader strategic goals, a single missile launch or burst of gunfire, even in self-defense, could have set off a chain of events difficult to control at a time of regional tension. The priority was to de-escalate rather than provoke. The MH-60R helicopters continued to monitor from above. They confirmed visually that weapons aboard the Venezuelan boats were no longer manned and that the vessels were increasing distance at cruising speed. Once all targets moved beyond the outer tracking zone, the helicopters returned to the carrier deck. The entire process was completed without direct radio communication. The absence of communication throughout the incident had increased the risk of misunderstanding. Naval protocols are built to account for such situations, using visual signals, sensor data, and tactical movement to interpret intent. In this case, the retreat itself became the clearest message, without speaking a word. The Venezuelan squadron acknowledged that continuing the approach would lead to consequences they were not prepared to face. The discipline of the U.S. crews played a central role in the outcome. From radar operators to flight crews, every action followed protocol. The absence of panic, even in a fast-moving and ambiguous environment, showed the value of training and experience. These were not routine exercises, the threat had been real, and the risk of escalation had been minutes away. As the carrier strike group continued its mission, the incident became a case study in controlled response. There was no victory claimed, no aggressive follow-up, only a calm return to operations. Yet within that calm lay the quiet success of military professionalism under pressure. What happened next would not play out on sonar screens or radar scopes. The confrontation had ended at sea, but the political impact was just beginning to surface. By mid-morning on the same day, the confrontation at sea had shifted to a new battlefield. This time, it was not about sonar, radar, or ship movements. The focus moved to screens, headlines, and diplomatic channels. Within hours, Venezuelan state television broadcast edited footage of fast patrol boats racing across open water. The video was paired with commentary claiming that the Navy had successfully intercepted and repelled a foreign vessel entering Venezuelan waters. In response, the United States Department of Defense released a series of high-resolution satellite images. These images were backed by time-stamped radar data from the Eisenhower strike group. The records showed the American ships operating in international waters, over 80 nautical miles from the Venezuelan coast. The materials were distributed through official channels and shared with international observers. The U.S. presentation was clear and detailed, structured to remove ambiguity. Official statements followed shortly after. The Pentagon described the incident as an example of reckless brinkmanship. The term highlighted the risk of unnecessary escalation caused by miscalculation. U.S. officials noted that the strike group had acted with restraint and remained within the boundaries of maritime law. From their perspective, the Venezuelan approach represented a disruption of regional stability. Venezuelan authorities issued their own statement, reaffirming the right to defend territorial integrity. They referred to the patrol operation as a defensive maneuver, in response to what they called an unauthorized presence. The wording suggested that the government did not see the action as hostile but as necessary. This framing allowed the leadership to claim victory without committing to further confrontation. Both sides made deliberate choices in how to describe the event. Neither accused the other of declaring war. Neither side mentioned casualties or damage, because there were none. Instead, the focus turned to interpretation. Each government positioned its narrative to support broader political goals. The U.S. message was aimed at reinforcing international norms and showing operational discipline. The Venezuelan message was intended to project internal strength and deterrence. Diplomatic teams began working behind the scenes. Communications between Washington and allied embassies intensified. Regional partners monitored the situation closely. The incident was not isolated. It became part of a larger pattern involving maritime patrols, territorial claims, and political signaling. What made this standoff different was how close it came to open conflict without a single shot being fired. The real battle, at least for now, had moved to forums, press briefings, and diplomatic memos. The exchange of fire had been avoided, but the exchange of narratives had only just begun. The standoff in the Caribbean left no casualties, no damage, and no official violations of international law. Yet, what it revealed was far more important than the absence of gunfire. The encounter between Venezuelan patrol boats and the USS Eisenhower strike group served as a reminder that modern naval confrontations can unfold in silence, with no direct communication and no clear warning until the moment of crisis. At the center of the problem was a radar misread. The Venezuelan crews had relied on static coordinates provided through shore-based systems. Their data was out of date by nearly 2 full days. They believed they were approaching a single destroyer. Instead, they found themselves inside the radar envelope of a full U.S. carrier group. That single assumption transformed a patrol into a potential conflict. Technology offers real-time tracking, high-resolution imaging, and global surveillance, but none of these systems replace human judgment. In this case, computers detected positions and speeds. Operators interpreted threat levels. Commanders weighed timing and consequences. The margin for error was measured in seconds. The consequences of failure would have been irreversible. What nearly occurred on that morning is known in military theory as threat mirroring. This is when one side views defensive movements from the other as offensive. If a ship activates its radar or arms a weapon system, the response from its counterpart can escalate quickly. Both sides believe they are defending themselves. Both move closer to confrontation without ever intending to start it. This is what made the incident so dangerous. Venezuela believed it was sending a signal of strength. The United States responded with disciplined containment. Neither side wanted war, but the actions taken by each were interpreted through layers of assumption, delay, and incomplete information. Naval operations often involve movement without explanation. In contested waters, that silence becomes the most dangerous factor.